Hi, everyone. This is our fourth day of 40 Days of Hope, and we're going to talk about how God speaks to us and how to get around when God tells us something and it takes a while for us to see the results. I have been doing some brainstorming just to refresh my mind. There are several ways how God speaks to us. A lot of people don't understand how God would still speak to them audibly back then, even though the prophets have heard him audibly in the Bible, and we all know that. But if God has spoke to people audibly back in history, why can't he speak to us audibly today? So I think he can speak, well, not just I think, I know that he can speak to us audibly. We haven't been trained how to hear him audibly, so we don't really know. A lot of us don't know what it is like, but God's voice is like a sweet sound, and it is musical since music is a powerful source. God's created music, and unfortunately, the enemy has power over the music. Speaking of the other ways that God speaks to us, he also speaks to us through the things that happen, so the things that are meant to be, through the Bible, which most people rely on to find God's messages, through wise people, and when those wise people know truth and they tell us truth, they are telling us what God told them. So God is telling us through them because they're telling us the truth. Sometimes God speaks to us through dreams, but as I said, the only words that can actually come from God is truth and wisdom. So if we hear words that are not true, they're just not from God. And sometimes we just know that something is true or is to be true. And when we're in that situation, it's when God put a thought in our minds directly. And when I talk about what God told me, people may think that I'm crazy. Okay. They think I'm crazy. That's their problem. But sometimes they don't understand the purpose. Sometimes when God tells me something, I don't always understand until I put in a bit of practice and a bit more thought. So, for an example, God wanted me in Amsterdam. I've had to learn it's not about the friendships. It's actually more about researching the things that go on in Amsterdam and a little bit about Amsterdam is when I have seen what went on through the Red Lake District, most of the stuff in the Red Lake District in Amsterdam, most workers there came from Eastern Europe. Some workers came from locally, whether they're working in a restaurant or working in a store. But most of the workers that work in the Red Lake District area are from Eastern Europe. So that would be Ukraine, Russia, Moldova, Bulgaria, Serbia, and a whole bunch of other countries in Eastern Europe, including Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, and so much more. And I sometimes wonder, why is God not having me go to Eastern Europe? Well, the behind the scenes of what brings forth the result to Amsterdam is from Eastern Europe. But the Eastern Europe does the pretty much like the box packing, where Amsterdam actually shows the result of what happens. As for another example of something that God has told me is God has told me to follow through with our through ministry, online Zoom ministry videos. And it's not just the video, but it's actually the interaction with those in the ministry. So that would be Alpha through Discovery Church, Alpha through the church in New York, and the campus church, and finally the prayer meetings at Discovery Church. The reason that God would want me following them, not only just for prayer, but also God wants me to come closer to Him and learn more about myself. So even though I was praying for my schoolwork, I did go through a phase of a discouragement, but I also had to learn the hope that if you give yourself patience and time, you see this hope a lot better than you do when you're expecting things to happen right away. Right away, we're supposed to think about the little things that we're supposed to do, but it can take years for the result to happen, and sometimes it takes longer than we want it to. That's okay. And sometimes God tells us it's going to take a while. Now, another thing was God told me to focus on my schoolwork, following through with video productions, and the reason for it was, even though God would like me to go into social work to help me understand what would be needed for my Women's Project Center, God wanted me to go through the video productions not only because I could do it, but because God knew that there were people in my life that were controlling, and that they'd be controlling for a while. And if you're wondering what I mean of controlling, I mean they have accused me of doing a lot of bad things. Maybe 5% of the accusations that they made were true, but most of the accusations were them trying to get attention. So even when I stop doing the bad things and they keep accusing me of doing bad things anyway, when I'm not doing the bad things anymore, this is more of a line of them being controlling, which is not right. And when they're being that way, we have to work through. They may be persistent. They may think that they have the right to do it, but that is not their right. They shouldn't be doing it. So while they are in a position of being controlling, I need to find other ways to educate myself. And if I can't bring an audience to help make a difference in the world, allowing myself to get educated can be a step in the right direction, even though have been going through a stage of discouragement. So then the next challenge that God has in my life is learning how to follow through and learning how to fight the discouragement that's in my life. I do not know what the future will hold. It's more something that God knows, but I know little hints of what God has told me, and some of those hints are to learn to tackle my weaknesses and turn them into strengths. And the other one is learning to work through my problems. Another one is that the education matters whether I get an audience or not. Even if I lose my audience for 5 years, God could say, well, if you lose your audience for 5 years, that could mean that you'll have to live with your parents for another 5 years, and you're going to continue through school and education for another 5 years. But the reason why I would know that is because God does not want us to waste our time. Time is precious, and we're on this earth for a purpose. So if I lose my audience for 5 years, I would think that God would want me to keep going after more education through the 5 years. But God hasn't told me how long it's exactly going to take for me to grow a big audience or to have an audience. It's more of God gave me a few hints on how long I could be with not so much of an audience. And another hint that God has told me is that a lot of people may have trust issues around me. So this could last for a while. As for, while COVID-19 is making things unpredictable, sometimes I don't know what God's telling me where I will be going. But I thought God wanted me to go to Laurentian University. And because they're doing in-class learning and I have my animals and I have to find a proper place to move, but I haven't found that in the northern area. Plus, my parents don't want me to move too far out of a city and expect me to go to school if I don't have a driver's license, unless if I find a friend with a driver's license. Otherwise, my parents may like me to learn to work on independent skills. So there's a lot more to discover. As I talked about my situation for you, most of the people who I went to church with, I've been to a few churches. I've been to Deep River Free Methodist Church, Trolls Road Free Methodist Church, Newcastle Fellowship Baptist Church, the Rehoboth Reformed Church in Bowmanville, the Vineyard Amsterdam Church, and even speaking through other Christians, most people who I know and who I've met in my life and who I've heard speak say that they get most of God's callings through the Bible, most of God's words through the Bible. And then the other part is interpreting the Bible. And interpreting the Bible is not something you just do on your own. Interpreting the Bible does take practice. And if you've never interpreted the Bible before, or you don't know where to start, if you want to try interpreting the Bible, try to get connected to a Christian college, either locally or find a good Christian college, and try to find a good Christian college in your life. And some Christian colleges that I know personally are Tyndale University, which I went to for a year in 2012 to 2013. And then there is other Bible colleges in Ontario, but haven't really searched them much. Another Bible college is Redeemer University, which is really good. And another one is, the other good Christian colleges are Briarcrest University in more the middle western coast of Canada. And the other one is called Boyce College. Boyce College is in Louisville, Kentucky. I have actually heard about it through both the cross conference and through Noel Musket sharing his story about how he experienced Boyce College and Southern Baptist Seminary. The seminary schools, you have to have your bachelor's to follow through with the seminary schools. And if you go into a seminary school, you have to really know that you're called into it, because Christian schools can be really expensive. But at the same time, they are good for you. And even if you don't have the money for the Christian college or university yet, there is hope that you can someday get into the Christian college or university. Sometimes you have to do an outline plan if you can't afford something yet. Like how much time it will take to save the money, and how much money can you save within a certain amount of time, how much it's going to cost, and what can you do to get that money into your bank account so you can study at a Christian college. And Christian colleges usually cost a lot more than the secular universities. And as saying so, some people have to work for 3 or 4 years before they can afford to go into a Christian college. And that can be okay. Now, there's other people who are fortunate that their parents can afford to pay for their college or university. But if a person does not have Christian family members, then they have to pay for the college or university by themselves. And that means they have to work for the money that they need for that education. And it's okay for people to have to work to get the education, because then your character builds through time. But it's not just the money, and it's not just the your grades. The other requirement for Tyndale University is having a background of being in church for more than 2 years. For those who go to Tyndale University who are not from a Christian home, they would get that access to it through going to a youth group. As for most people in that position will be working for 4 years before they get into the school. And while they're not in the school yet, then they can seek guidance from their former leaders at their own church, who can counsel them and shape them to be the person that they have to be in their life. As for, I have been tempted to put away my OSAP, but I've asked some questions with financial aid, so that helped with putting away fear and discouragement. But if God was to tell me that audibly, I would have not known. But for a person who works in the area of financial aid telling me that, and they have their information and they have their knowledge, that I would know that I don't have to be afraid of having OSAP anymore. So even though I believe God could speak to me directly, sometimes I need to check certain things out to know for sure if it's from God or not. As for as I mentioned about some of the things to work towards the things that you can't afford yet. Sometimes God does want us to push fundraising and to tell people that they need to help with a fundraising event because that we have a particular need. And sometimes it is difficult, and if people don't believe it or they don't want to listen to it, then they may make fun of it. But we can be sure that the consequences will come even if they don't happen right away. And when those things come, is not on our expectation, but more under God's plan. It's one of those things, we don't see it right away, we see it through time. And even when we say what we have to say, it doesn't always work to our own plan, because part of it depends on if other people listen or not. If they listen, things work faster. When they don't listen, it takes so much longer. And when things are not working out very well, when God tells us that we need to do something and it's not working out very well, that's when we have to keep praying to God over and over again. Even if it takes to lock ourselves in our room just to pray, sometimes that's just all that God wants during this very moment. Just lock ourselves in a room and pray and pray and pray and pray. And this is if we're failing to get any audience, if we're failing to be heard, if we're failing for things to work out, that we just have to lock ourselves in a room and pray. And even if we skip meals just to pray, that's okay. And if there's something that's causing us to not be able to sleep, that is just important to just be in there and only pray. Some people, the average person will pray for probably about 10 or 15 minutes. And they may think that that's quite the prayer. But sometimes there is something called repetitive prayer, which is where you just express your feelings to God, even if it's over the same thing. And whether it is a quick prayer or a long prayer, God can still listen. And God likes to engage with our prayers. Sometimes when we're in a long prayer, we may not always know why we're in the situation. And sometimes there's moments where you could be praying for a very, very long time, and you might hear an angel in the corner of your room. And then you finish praying, you don't see the angel, but then God could send an angel again. Back in the Bible, we've seen examples of how God sent angels to people. And there is a series called Touched by an Angel, but the Touched by an Angel is stories about how angels could be in our everyday lives. But whether or not or anything, we don't expect angels to come right away. But they only come when it's important. And if we are surrounded by angels, we may not be able to see them yet. But if we see an angel and hear a message from the angel, we know for sure that it's from God. If it is God's angel, because God's angels will never lie to us. Now, after going through the topic about how God speaks to us, this can be for like very long periods of time, because there's so much that can be talked about on how God speaks to us. I haven't put any Bible verses on how God speaks to us, but if you have any questions and you write them in the comments, I can try to see how I can answer them for another time when I go into another podcast of 40 Days for Hope. And I hope to share about it tomorrow. Thank you guys for listening.